The government response to the coronavirus outbreak has faced criticism for being too slow in its early stages. And while several countries in Europe are beginning to ease lockdown restrictions, questions remain over how the lockdown could be lifted here. Well, joining me now is the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. His Institute for Global Change has come up with some proposals on how this could be done today. And Mr. Blair, presumably if you come up with these proposals, it's because you think the Boris Johnson government needs some help.
Well, it's such a huge issue, and the Institute's been working on what are the types of measures you might take in order to ease the lockdown, and how do you do it most successfully? Because the problem with this is, I mean, it is the most complicated and difficult challenge I have ever seen in politics. So, you know, I have every sympathy and solidarity for people who are in power and taking decisions. This is our attempt not to criticise, but to offer constructive advice. Yeah,
but how do you think they are doing so far?
Well, I think, you know, as your reports have suggested, and I think people in government would accept this, we were probably slow in the first stages of the disease. We're now in the suppression phase, which is absolutely necessary. Really what we're trying to do is to look forward and say the economic and indeed health damage of this lockdown is so severe that we've got to put everything in place now, all the preparedness we need in order to make sure we can ease the lockdown as much as possible while still being responsible about the spread of the disease. And I think this is an extraordinarily difficult challenge. And in the paper, what we suggest is ways that government could be reordered around the central tasks of this. So things like the acquisition of protective equipment, mass testing, tracing. In my view, you need in each of these areas, you've got to have the right senior person in charge, politician, and someone probably from the outside. A lot of these things require private sector, not public sector skills, and the right expertise in order that in this preparation phase, you're doing everything you possibly can so that when you start to ease, you've got the best chance of getting economic activity going.
I do want to come on to that in a moment, and I'm glad to say we've got the time, but I do just want to ask you, as things stand, do you think we are at the right point in policy terms of continuing with the lockdown at this level?
Yes, you've got to continue with this degree of suppression until the scientific and medical advice is that you're on top of the disease. Now, by the way, even when you ease the lockdown, you're going to find outbreaks. I mean, all the countries that have eased have found problems arising. You've then got to move very swiftly to contain those problems and push it back down again. But no, you can't lift the suppression prematurely. I think we know enough about this disease. We don't know as much as we need to know, but we know enough about it to know that its severity is such that you can't take a risk and just let it run through the population.
I mean, you've proposed that there should be czars or people in control of mass testing, of PPE, of business consultation, of vaccines, of school openings, of tech, of tracing, of shielding, of international travel, of communications, 10 areas. I mean, doesn't that run the risk of just too many chiefs running around?
No, because I think it's, you know, the way of looking at this is, in normal government, as you know, Adam, as well as I do, you know, you have different government departments, right? You have your health department, your industry department, your education department, and so on. Today, the whole of government is COVID-19. So and there are many different facets and dimensions to it. So if you just take this issue of mass testing, I can't see any way out of this lockdown unless you do mass testing. And to do that, and do it in the right combination of the PCR test, which is the test that tells you whether you have the disease, the antibody test, which tells you whether you have had the disease, to do this in the right combination at scale, where you may be testing a significant proportion of the population. I can't see how you do that unless you've got a massive logistical and procurement exercise underway. So that's almost like a government department. So I'm just suggesting these 10 areas where if I was back in government today, there would be a senior minister, probably a senior business person alongside them, with the right technical advice, doing absolutely nothing other than just focusing 100% on that. And the government, in a way, by appointing Lord Dayton, who they've now appointed in charge of the protective equipment side of this, I mean, is in a sense a recognition that this is what you need. But I think you need this in many different areas. I mean, how do you restart international travel again? And, you know, at the moment, it doesn't seem likely you can do this for several months, maybe. But if you can't get your airlines moving again, and if you're a country like Britain that depends on trade and you've got busy airports and you need people to come in and out of your country, what are the restrictions you put around that? What are the ways you manage to do it safely? These are massive and difficult questions. So I'm saying that each of these areas should really have its own, almost like a kind of government department working on it.
I mean, most of these are questions for domestic organisation, but just to pick up on airlines, I mean, it doesn't matter what we say about airlines, it's going to require international cooperation, isn't it, to get airlines going again? And there's not much sign of that, looking at the way the G7 and the G20 have been working.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. But, I mean, one of the things you would do when you're looking at international travel is try and achieve that cooperation, because all countries are in the same position. And look, what your report, I was just listening to your report from Cornwall, and that's just one, you know, that's one county of the UK. But you just think about that picture, which is pretty devastating in its economic implications. You think of that replicated across the UK and then replicated across every one of the major countries in the world. I mean, that's what we're looking at. So, you know, it's not, yes, of course, you're going to need global coordination around this. And one of the things I find shocking is the absence of that, or the absence of enough of it. But you're also going to need, therefore, the organisation within your own government to be able to do that coordination effectively.
Why do you think it is that the UK, the US and Italy and France probably are those currently worst hit by this outbreak? What's gone wrong in our societies?
It's difficult to work that out. I mean, there are explanations. So, for example, one of the reasons why South Korea and Hong Kong, Singapore got on top of this very early was because they went through the SARS outbreak back in 2003. So they were taught a lesson and they learned that lesson. It's partly because we have got, you know, populations that are very global in their nature, that move around. So in America, you can see the concentrations on the West Coast and the East Coast. You know, there are lots of different explanations for it, but I think there's enough experience now to know and be able to learn some of the lessons of this. And that's really one of the things we try and do in the paper, is go through the experiences of other countries and say, look, this is what has worked and what hasn't worked. So, for example, if you take the next few weeks, because we're in lockdown, let's say, for another 3 weeks.
You think it's only going to be 3 weeks?
There are
it's going to be longer,
countries that are going to
it?
be opening up during that time.
It's going to be longer than 3 weeks, isn't it?
Well, it's 3 weeks at least, let's say. So my point is, you've got the time to learn the lessons of what's going on around the world, because there are countries opening up. So you're able to do that. There are a lot of lessons now about the best way to trace. So this combination of testing and tracing, there are a lot of lessons that you can learn as to the best way to do that. And then you've got this whole issue to do with therapeutics and vaccines. So we are doing a lot in the UK. I mean, we've got a very strong bioscience sector ourselves in the UK. So we'll be doing a lot, but there are a whole set of treatments going on, being experimented with around the world. You've got to make sure that, I mean, maybe we invent the vaccine that does this here in the UK, but maybe we don't. You've got to make sure that you're also in touch and connected with vaccine analysis and the potential for production of vaccine from around the world. I mean, if you take Ebola, first of all, by the way, it took about 5 years to get a vaccine, but secondly, the vaccine was actually invented, not surprisingly enough, in Silicon Valley, but in a part of the Canadian healthcare system. So, you know, all the way through in this, it's just a very simple point I'm making, that right now, okay, forget whether we were behind the curve or not in the past, right now, we need to do absolutely everything to reposition government so that we can get our economy moving again.
Do you have a model country? Do you have a country where you look at them and you think, yes, they are getting it right? I mean, is it Germany, for example?
Well, Germany have definitely done well. South Korea is obviously a good example. But, you know, there's different experiences on different things. So I would say you could look, for example, at South Korea on the testing and tracing side. In Germany, I think they had the advantage. They don't have as strong an innovation in bioscience as we do, but they have a much stronger diagnostic sector, so they've been able to use that. I think one of the other things that we need to look at is how do we start repurposing some of our own manufacturing to produce things like the protective clothing and equipment. You know, I can't believe that we're going to be going back to work without most of us wearing masks. I may be wrong, but I think, so you're going to need mass production of that. And on testing, by the way, you're going to need to be able to test people several times because there are problems with both the PCR tests and the antibody tests. The PCR test will only tell you if you have the disease on that day, right? Which is obviously important and valuable information. But it won't. You could have the test on a Monday and then find on Tuesday you get the disease. The antibody test is a very valuable test because it tells you whether you've had the disease. But the evidence again is from different ways of doing this around the world that it's really a matter of timing as to whether that test is accurate or not. In other words, if you're tested as to whether you've had the disease or have it through an antibody test in the first week or so, the tests are often inaccurate. After 11 days or 2 weeks, they're mainly accurate. You've got to, so all of these things are really difficult to work out. How do you combine those tests together effectively? You know, these are questions that we need to be studying from the practice around the world, and that's why I think you've got to have this concentrated firepower on each one of these issues.
Why do you say we'd all be wearing masks? I mean, if you were Prime Minister, having looked at the evidence, would you be saying, yeah, we're going to have to wear masks, ordering it?
I think you can't be conclusive about that yet, but I would say if you look at the trends, and again, if you look at the Asian trends particularly, containment, masks have got a role to play. And the other thing is that they can often, it's not just that I think they do have some validity, but I think they also will make people feel more confident. Because one of the things this is one of the other things we suggest, which is why I think it's right to be having this debate now and to bring the public into the debate. You could lift these restrictions and find people just don't feel safe enough. So for example, you could say, well, restaurants could open up if they do X, Y, and Z, or some restaurants could, or we're going to experiment in this area. But if the public don't feel that they're safe enough, same with opening schools, by the way, then they're just not going to come. So I think the wearing of masks may be, I don't think you can conclude that right now, but I certainly would be looking at that and studying that very intensely and very clearly. Likewise, how far are you going to be quite intrusive on the tracing and the use of technology around that? Again, the evidence is that you need to be pretty intrusive about it for it to work effectively.
Now, I want to ask you about responsibility. You, of course, with the whole post 9/11 and in the Iraq war, you were held accountable and there was a public investigation. I mean, if we have a situation where more people died because the government was slow off the mark, or we have a situation as we've had this weekend where the government said we're going to get a consignment of PPE from Turkey and it doesn't come, is it fair to hold the Prime Minister and ministers accountable for those failures which have fairly drastic consequences?
Well, I just think it's important in these circumstances, having been in the situation myself of taking difficult decisions in government, I just think it's important to realise, and this is why whatever I'm saying, I put in the bracket of constructive advice, not criticism. I mean, this is a hellishly difficult challenge, right? There's never been anything like it. And so, you know, it will be very easy to come along in hindsight and say, well, you could have done this and you could have done that. And that will happen, by the way, whether I think it should happen or not. But I just think it's important right now. It shouldn't be the focus of our attention. The focus of our attention should be to make sure that the next phase of this, which is the controlled, managed revival of the economy, happens in the best way possible.
But that is one of the things we ought to prepare for, is to learn the lessons, isn't it?
Sure, and I think learning the lessons is always valuable. You know, pointing the finger is sometimes less valuable, but it's really, there will come a point when you learn the lessons, But I think right now the only purpose of learning them is to make sure you get the next phase of this right. And my suggestion today in the detailed paper we produce about how you might exit from lockdown, we go through different sectors and so on, is, just this is so difficult to do correctly that you need right now, because you have these few weeks when the lockdown is going to continue, right now just identify each dimension and make sure that you have the right structure in place to deal with it effectively.